the argument there is, again, something I've worked on, which is, what has now come to be called interaction theory, and the idea that our interactions, our bodily interactions within certain pragmatic environments, do a lot of the work when it comes to our ability to understand the other person.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anagoge Podcast. Today we have Shaun, and I've met Shaun, or rather, I've started digging into his work when I saw a fairly random YouTube video about Morrie cognitive science. And this, as you may know, if you follow my podcast, I'm a fairly big fan of cognitive science. And then I dug a little bit into his work. He just seemed very experienced in the field. He has done this for a very long time. Also like that he has a very strong philosophical background, which is fairly common in cognitive science, unlike other branches of psychology and whatnot. And I was just really impressed, and I just figured I would try to have a conversation with him, and he was kind enough to accept. And so here we are. And so hello, Shaun, and thank you so much for coming.
Hi, Tiago. Good to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Fantastic. And it's funny because I actually didn't, at the time, I didn't actually quite realize how big you were in the field. Obviously, I saw that you had a lot of research going on, but I didn't quite understand how leading you were in some ways. And it's funny because I actually have the textbook of Morrie cognitive science. I think Cambridge one. I think the handbook.
The Oxford, it's the Oxford handbook.
Oxford, which I'm still struggling to finish.
It's a large book. Yeah,
it's a beast. But I just realized now that you are like one a contributor or editor, right?
Yeah, I'm an editor on that. That's right.
Cool. I just found it funny that I've been kind of having this schedule and didn't even notice. So maybe let's start with, I would like to start about like a short introduction of you as a scholar, an academic, and like a personal view of how did you come into philosophy? Like how did you decide to study it? What was kind of like your influence, and why did you get into this subject rather than anything else?
Sure. Yeah, well, I studied it in undergraduate university and fell in love with it, and basically decided that's what I wanted to do, spend my time reading philosophy and thinking about things like that. So I was especially influenced by a course I took on existentialism. So we were reading people like Camus and Sartre, and I wanted to know, where did all of this existentialism come from? How to understand it in the context of the whole history of philosophy. And that led me back, of course, to phenomenology and to the work of Husserl and Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and so forth. So when I went to grad school, I really focused on phenomenology. So I would say my graduate training is primarily in phenomenology. And I was, of all those classic authors, I was most influenced by Merleau-Ponty, reading his work, which turns out to be, his early work is very interdisciplinary and takes you to considerations about neurology, psychology, developmental psychology, and so forth, all of which he was reading and contributing to, in terms of his philosophical and phenomenological considerations. So I started to look then at some of the more contemporary neuroscience and psychology, and I tried to sort of you might say update in my graduate work. I tried to sort of update Merleau-Ponty's work. And that ultimately led me to the cognitive sciences, which took me a while to figure out what the cognitive sciences were all about. But I thought then that phenomenology might be able to contribute something to the cognitive sciences. And sort of that's a project I took on. So that was one thing. I was, just about the time I was, discovering that as a project, I was just finishing up another project, which was on hermeneutics. So I published a book on hermeneutics and education. But since the time of that publication, that was in 1991, I was at that point heavily involved, meeting all kinds of wonderful people in psychology, developmental psychology, neuroscience, and being able to interact with them. I was kind of re-educated, so to speak, in the cognitive sciences, and that's been my focus ever since.
Mm-hmm. And so when was roughly the period when you started getting into cognitive science?
Really, it was in the early 90s. So one thing that sort of brought me there was an invitation to a week-long workshop at King's College, Cambridge, in the UK. A psychologist named Tony Marcel had read some of my articles and thought it would be nice to have me in this workshop. And I met there not only Tony, but Jonathan Cole, who was doing neurophysiology, Andrew Meltzoff, and all kinds of other people, philosophers, mainly analytic philosophers. So I felt like I was the token phenomenologist. And suddenly I saw that this type of setting would be very likely the type of setting that Merleau-Ponty would turn up at if he had been alive at that point. So I really felt at home suddenly, and started to read the analytic philosophy at that point, and into more deeply into the sciences. And so I would say the early 90s would be the time I really got into that.
Cool. And I actually didn't know that Ponty was actually that's interdisciplinary. That's something that I really respect, and I think that's truly where the gold nuggets of wisdom and knowledge are. Even though it's always so tricky, because I feel that's truly where the value of most things are, but it's so difficult to achieve, because the more you branch out, the less of an expert you are on anything. And so I see when a lot of people try to do that, it's a lot more easy to oversimplify things, and it's just very tricky. But obviously, Ponty and others like you are very smart. So
well, I think very lucky too. So I mean, in those days, I talked to phenomenologists, some of them who had tried to do this, but met with resistance, trying to talk to psychologists, saying, well, we don't really need philosophy here. So they didn't always succeed. I think in my attempt to enter into discussion with psychologists, I've just been very lucky to find the ones who are open to talking with philosophers, and they really helped me, I think, in terms of some co-authoring and great discussions and so forth. So I've been lucky. Yeah.
I think also the fact that you're in cognitive science, I think that helps a lot, because it has such a philosophical root. But for example, I'm in I have a similar problem sometimes when I'm kind of like in the philosophy and then on the neuroscience camps. They really don't like to talk with each other. The philosophy is like, well, neuroscience tells almost nothing about the true nature of the mind. And then the neuroscience, well, it's like philosophy is completely useless. Like as long as we can scan people's brains, then we'll figure it out. It's a very tough conversation. But I think cognitive science is, precisely the reason why it attracts me so much is because it's very friendly to all these fields, and even more like anthropology, artificial intelligence.
Yeah. Meant to be an interdisciplinary project, really, not just a branch of one other science like psychology. A lot of times psychologists would think that, cognitive science is like a branch of psychology, but that's the wrong way to think of it. I think cognitive science is just this interdisciplinary project that draws on psychology and anthropology and artificial intelligence and so forth. So philosophy included.
Right. So I'd like to get into phenomenology a little bit, and it's funny because in some sense it's almost as if it's like one of the most basic aspects of philosophy, because it's kind of like what you have with you all the time, which is experience. But at the same time, I think because of the Enlightenment's rationalism, like the over scientific worldview, we kind of have like the idea itself almost seems absurd at times, especially if you have a scientific education. And so there's this funny paradox when it's something so close to humanity, let's say, to philosophy, but a lot of times also people have a tough time grasping it within our current culture, and it's also deceptively simple. Like it's very easy to think that it's something very straightforward. So, for example, if I'm describing my experience, that I just describe it. I just speak what comes to my mind. And there's something to it, but it's certainly a lot more complicated than that. And even though I've been heavily influenced by phenomenology and reading some of its authors, I never went super deep into it, especially the more academic side. And so I actually don't know exactly how it's done and kind of like some of the common problems that it's typically encountered. I know they exist. I just don't have it very articulated in my mind. So maybe let's explore that a little bit. Like, why is phenomenology more complex than it might appear, and some of the philosophical and scientific that's you kind of run into it.
Sure. It's a great question, and there's a lot of complexity about the answer to it as well. First of all, I mean, there's a kind of distinction between phenomenology as a philosophical method developed by the classic phenomenologists, people like Husserl. And then in contrast to that, there's a lot of discussion within cognitive science about phenomenology, where phenomenology just means experience, just, the phenomenology, the experience that I have, the qualia that I experience, and so forth. So that's often referred to as phenomenology. And in cognitive science, then, when you say phenomenology, it doesn't always mean the kind of tradition of the philosophical tradition that follows Husserl. So my own, focus has been coming from that philosophical tradition, and then, once we get clear on that, another complexity is that, well, there is no one theory of phenomenology, or there's no one phenomenological approach that all of the classic authors somehow would agree on. So Husserl can be contrasted with Heidegger and contrasted with Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. And almost any time a person starts to consider phenomenology, they come at it perhaps from a different starting point. So a lot of times the phenomenological method is associated with Husserl's work, but that doesn't always flow nicely into some of the other phenomenologists. So yeah, as you say, it's not just a matter of trying to describe what you're experiencing. Husserl outlines a whole set of methods, including what he calls the phenomenological reduction or the epoche, and that is an attempt to exclude any kind of theoretical judgments, any biases, trying to get, he would describe it as something like get to the pure experience in order to be able to deal with that. And then once you start looking in that fashion, you start to discover structures that you want to discuss. And although Husserl, by doing this phenomenological reduction, this epoche, this bracketing out of theoretical considerations, trying to get to the pure experience, although he does that, he nonetheless, in the end, comes back to some theoretical concepts, and he doesn't, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, the phenomenological reduction is always incomplete. It's always something you have to keep renewing as you do your analysis, but it's never something that gives you an absolute insight into experience. So the kind of classic authors themselves have different disagreements about how to do phenomenology. And then when you start to mix phenomenology with cognitive science and see how it can contribute to, or how it can learn from, the empirical experimental work that's done in the different sciences, then it gets even, I think, more complicated. So there are some contemporary developments that have been worked out by people like Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and then some of their colleagues who focus on phenomenological interviews, as using phenomenological interviews as part of the method that can be combined with empirical study. So you get a real spectrum of conceptions of what phenomenology is, how it works, and it's not easy to find total agreement, even among the phenomenologists.
So you mentioned kind of like that we can, obviously this is a spectrum, but if we're oversimplifying it a little bit, so we can kind of consider phenomenology with a philosophical dimension and a kind of like a psychological, more empirical dimension. Do you think that the psychological one is just like one way that they're trying to kind of conceptualize and explore qualia, and that's what they should do, and that's kind of like a thing on its own right? Or do you think that they're kind of losing sight of the philosophical tradition, and they should keep that tradition into account and have a more robust philosophical foundation rather than trying to be just simply very empirical about it?
Okay, so that distinction between, say, the philosophical, or what Husserl called the transcendental on the one side, and then what he called phenomenological psychology on the other side, which meets up with the empirical side of things. That distinction is, I think, one that is important, especially when people talk about naturalizing phenomenology, where the idea is there, well, depending upon who you're talking to, what it means. But from my perspective, I think it simply means trying to bring phenomenology into play when you're doing experimental work, or when you're trying to work out theories of cognition. In any case, it's not just about qualia in that respect. So phenomenological psychology, I think, inherits some of the same issues and some of the same types of topics that are to be considered. They inherit those from the transcendental side, from the philosophical side. So there's a connection. At least if you read Husserl, that's the way he thinks of it. And I think also Merleau-Ponty and a lot of phenomenologists will say, well, it's not just about qualia, the kind of bare, sensory experience of things. It's about intentionality, which is a certain structure of consciousness. It's about temporality. It's about our experience of time and the way that our experience itself has a temporal structure. It's about embodiment. It's about, that is to say, how bodily processes contribute to cognition. It's about intersubjectivity, along the same idea that intersubjective relationships somehow or other contribute to cognitive processes. And there's a whole set of topics, I would say, that phenomenology points to that get carried over into the work that psychology, phenomenological psychology is supposed to be doing. So it's again, I think the caricature of phenomenology is simply that, it's something like introspection and you're looking to try to explain qualia. But that's a very small part of phenomenology, and it's not so straightforward even in phenomenology. That's what you're doing.
Right. So something that I really like about phenomenology is that, at least to me, it's a really good example of the importance of philosophy to science, because a lot of people think that it's something very abstract that doesn't make a difference anywhere in the real world and in actual scientific progress. And to me, when phenomenology touches on cognitive science, to me that's the best example of why exactly that view is wrong, because so much progress has been made exactly by these types of deeper topics beyond just basic experience that you mentioned, like intentionality, embodiment, etc. I'm particularly impressed by how these developments have led to different views on artificial intelligence, for example. How kind of like viewing the mind as simply like a computational model of like symbols changing around and stuff like that. That's a lot more complicated than that. And I think the philosophy is kind of what's brought that into the spotlight, and then psychology and cognitive science we're kind of like forced to change how they thought about cognition. But because you're so much more experienced and knowledgeable than me, I'd like to hear your take on how exactly do you think is the best example of philosophy informing science, and you can kind of like specify it more towards cognitive science.
Oh, that's really difficult to say. Here's the one example.
Okay, just a good one. So it doesn't have to be the highest.
Sure. Well, you mentioned, of course, artificial intelligence. The work of Dreyfus, who was very much inspired by his reading of Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, especially. He didn't like Husserl as much, but Merleau-Ponty especially, and Heidegger gave him great inspiration. And his critique of artificial intelligence back in the 1970s was, in some way, the first kind of major foray into cognitive science, bringing phenomenology into cognitive science. But it was a very critical, negative way of doing it. He was saying, this is what computers cannot do. This is what artificial intelligence cannot do. What computers can't do. And he did a second edition later, what computers still can't do, and so forth. Artificial intelligence is getting very sophisticated these days, and it's not quite clear that all of his arguments would still hold up. But nonetheless, he was drawing on issues having to do with embodiment, especially, and very pragmatic, body environmental relationships that seemed quite beyond the kind of good old-fashioned artificial intelligence approach. So I think he had some influence, despite the fact that not a lot of people liked this critique, from the AI perspective. They didn't like it, but and a lot of the work and a lot of the funding kept going on that same track. But nonetheless, I think some people like Rodney Brooks, the kind of robotics that he started to conceive of was very much influenced. He even mentions Heidegger at some point, but I think very much influenced by someone like Dreyfus. I think that's early work and in some way critical of cognitive science. And I think then with someone like Francisco Varela, who was a scientist himself, a neurobiologist, he came under the influence of phenomenology as well as other things like Buddhism and so forth. And he brought us into a kind of more positive relationship. What can phenomenology actually do? What can it contribute to our conceptions of cognition? And so his neurophenomenology project, I thought, was also another kind of important milestone in this whole development.
Awesome, and that was a really good contrast between Dreyfus and kind of Varela. I didn't even think about it before, but now it's very, very clear in my mind how he in the beginning was more kind of like oppositional. It's kind of like you're a bunch of idiots, like you're not really seeing this problem correctly. Well, Varela was like really trying to bring everything together, which is a lot productive. So you mentioned when you were kind of giving a little introduction of yourself that you were inspired by like existentialism and you were very attracted to those things. But then when I see you mention phenomenology, I get the impression that you're more influenced by Ponty, for example. And I have the impression that I have, and I haven't studied them very well, is that Ponty, for example, was very, very worried about notions of, for example, embodiment and stuff like that, but also perception. And to me, he strikes me more as a revolutionary psychologist rather than an existentialist, for example. And people like Heidegger, at least to me, that's really where kind of like the peak of existentialism and phenomenology meet. So maybe kind of clarify that a little bit. If existentialism is still a big interest of you, and how exactly people like Ponty fit in.
Yeah, that also is a very complicated question, or requires a complicated answer. So, of course, a lot of people point to Heidegger and say there's sort of the center of the whole existentialist project. And yet Heidegger himself indicated that he was not an existentialist. He was much more interested in ontology or the question of being and so forth. And his analysis, which focused on human existence, was only for, in his perspective, only for purposes of trying to get at the bigger question of being. So a lot of people then think that Jean-Paul Sartre is the real existentialist, and he defends existentialism. In fact, as a kind of, he says, as a kind of humanism where human existence is sort of central. Merleau-Ponty, I think, is more complicated, but let me say that Merleau-Ponty is not the only existentialist. Sometimes he's considered an existentialist. He's friends with Sartre and Camus and all that, and sometimes he's considered a phenomenologist. And what you find in Merleau-Ponty is this kind of interdisciplinary idea of consulting the sciences like neurology and psychology. But you find that also in Sartre, especially the early Sartre in the 1930s when he's writing about the imagination. He's looking at the empirical literature. He's doing a broad review of the psychology. It's sort of usually existentialism is, for Sartre is, being and nothingness, which comes a little bit later. I would say, I find it still fascinating to read the existentialists, and there's something about this which turns up in very recent work in a philosophy of psychiatry, for example, where people start to talk about a certain existential dimension that has to be considered when thinking about how to understand psychopathology, where the existential dimension is considered to be the idea that a person has a kind of self-reflective awareness of themselves, and that can be part of what contributes to anxiety, part of what contributes or a possible way to get at the right kind of therapy for that patient and so forth. So a good example of this is Sanaka Dahan's recent work on enactive psychiatry, where she takes the kind of a very broad approach that includes the psychosocial type of view, but also adds the existentialist perspective. That's not, I think, mainstream, existentialism of the sort that Jean-Paul Sartre was doing, but it's nonetheless something that I think can be linked to that whole phenomenological existentialist connection. And I think it becomes a very important point when you start thinking about something like psychopathology. So I think there's still, it's there as a kind of rich resource that one can draw on at the right point when one's trying to understand various aspects of cognition, or when cognition goes wrong, and what it's supposed to be like, and also leading perhaps even into ethical considerations.
Awesome. That was very well put. And since you mentioned psychopathology, I know you've done some work on it. Then maybe let's try to connect that to cognitive science. So, what can cognitive science, especially its more recent kind of branches and approaches, so for example, the idea of embodiment, how can that tell us anything about psychopathology?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think of psychopathology as, what can go wrong with cognitive systems, then I think there's a direct connection to be made and to be explored. So one has to look at the cognitive system as including the brain, the body, the environment. One has to think that something can go wrong with brain processes that could lead to psychopathology, right? That's the typical way of thinking of it. One can also think that there might be some kind of embodied problem that could lead also to problems, and one can also think of that the environment could also contribute to the type of psychopathology, and the environment meaning not just the physical environment, but also the social environment. So if you think of the system in that way, you can start asking broader questions, not simply, what are the neural processes that have been disrupted in schizophrenia, but you can ask, what is bodily experience like, and what if you change the environment? Would that help this patient? If you and people do this in terms of things like movement therapy, dance therapy. What if you change bodily processes, even sensory motor processes in a way? Would that somehow or other address some of the symptoms in psychopathology? So it's not just, I think in other words, the focus on embodiment and extended cognition and things like that offer that focus offers alternative types of therapy. So it doesn't simply have to be medication directed at neuronal processes. It can be therapy directed at bodily processes, at environmental arrangements, and I think that opens up a kind of set of, I call them therapeutic affordances, that allow us to allow the therapist, for example, to take a number of different approaches to treating a patient, where it might be partially medication, but it might also be partially a kind of movement therapy or a change of environment and so forth. In fact, there's been a lot of research going on now using virtual reality environments or simulations to address some serious psychopathological conditions, and that means you're basically changing the environment and seeing how that might affect, or you're using the environment in some way to understand what's going on in the psychopathological process. So there's been a lot of work at the University of London, for example, on this, but other places as well.
That's very interesting about virtual reality. I wasn't aware of that. Can you give maybe a specific example of, for example, a specific pathology of a study that comes to mind where they're trying to to treat or to help that condition, and why exactly does it work?
Yeah, well, there's a number of things. So for a good while, I think it's Giuseppe Riva in Italy has been doing experiments using virtual reality, looking at anorexia nervosa, so body image problems, and manipulating, for example, the experience of the body and the environment as a way that one could perhaps treat anorexia. At the University of London, people are working on schizophrenia. So they're looking at putting a patient in a particular setting where the patient can sort of safely explore their feelings about what's going on. So if you are a paranoid schizophrenic, riding a subway in London is a scary experience. But if you can safely put, in a therapeutic context, put the patient in a virtual subway, and then work with them in that context, that can be productive. There are also very clear applications for the treatment of phobias. So again, at the University of London, they've been doing some work there, looking at how people who are anxious and suffering from phobias having to do with I don't know what, spiders or marketplaces or what have you, they can put the patient in a setting where they feel safe, virtual reality setting, and then they can try to work through the various issues having to do with that phobia. those are some of the applications. I think it's very interesting. I have not myself worked with virtual reality in precisely that area of research, but I have used virtual reality along with a team of researchers to study experiences of awe and wonder during spaceflight, for example, and that's been really exciting for me, and it's quite an enjoyable project to work on. So I'm a big fan of virtual reality.
Awesome. That did make it a lot more clear in my mind how exactly that might work. And I also did see your work of the awe elements in kind of the space flights, and we'll get that in a second. That was also very, very interesting. But we've been talking about cognitive science, and we've kind of mentioned from time to time it's more like it's more recent branches related to embodiment and stuff like that. So maybe for people that are not familiar with it, let's try to get a base of what actually that means. So you're a great person to ask. So what exactly is Fourier cognition? What's each E, and why is it important, and why does it differ from traditional cognitive science?
Sure. So the idea of 4 E's, which is embodied, embedded, extended, and inactive cognition, is that I think the 4E idea is an attempt to try to capture as much of the sort of embodied cognition approaches as possible. And the first E, embodied, that is maybe the most general thing, and in some way it includes the other E's, but one can be very specific about how specifically, how the body contributes to cognition, just in terms of things like sensory motor processes. So looking at how movement through the environment can contribute to perception. There's a lot of experimental work that basically, focuses on movement and not just movement and sensory motor processes, but also affective processes. So emotion, which one can think of as a very embodied set of processes. How emotion will perhaps bias perception or bias the way one thinks. There's one experiment I always like to point to by a guy named Denziger, who looks at trial judges and shows that the judgment made about sentencing judgments made when the judge is hungry turn out to be stricter, or stricter than when the judge is satiated. So just after, in the beginning of the morning, the judge seems to be much more lenient. As it gets towards lunchtime, the judge gets stricter in his or her rulings, and then after lunch it goes back up to leniency. And there are specific percentages that are cited here. So affect, taken in a very broad sense to include things like hunger or fatigue or pain, that can change the way you perceive the world, that can change the way that you can judge how things ought to go, and so forth and so on. So that would fall under kind of the first E, embodiment. The second is extended, and that basically shifts the emphasis a little bit towards the environment. So a body is always in a particular environment, and the environment can in fact contribute to those processes that have an impact on cognition. So the tricky part here is to distinguish between embedded and extended, because extended cognition also emphasizes the environment. So examples that I think fall under the heading of embedded would be things such as the idea of affordances developed by Gibson in ecological psychology, and that could work. But also we could think of distributed cognition, the way we interact with a whole set of instruments in order to accomplish some task, and the importance of the interaction with the instruments for cognition. When you come to extended cognition, you find very similar claims, but the claims, I think, simply get stronger. So whereas the embedded cognition of people who would say, well, there are causal relations here. So certain things in the environment could cause us to think in a certain way. On the extended notion of cognition, which is very much associated now with Andy Clark, for example, the stronger claim is somehow or other that cognition is constituted by those the couplings between body and environment, between the cognitive system includes environmental processes. So the famous example is Otto's notebook in Andy Clark, David Chalmers and Andy Clark's essay on extended mind, where Otto, of course, has some problems with memory. He consults his notebook in order to try to remember things. And so his notebook is serving some of the same functions as biological memory. So it should be considered part of the cognitive system, contributing to the cognitive processes and so forth. So the extended version or the extended cognition approach seems to make stronger claims about the very nature of cognition. And then finally, the enactive approach, which comes out of the work by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and people like that. They also think that the environment is important. They think that the body is important. And the contrast, let's say, between the extended mind and the inactive mind is along the lines of how they treat the importance of the body, first of all. And that, for example, is for the extended mind, they think of it in functionalist terms, so that it's true that the body plays a role, but it doesn't matter whether the body we're talking about is a human body or an animal body or a robot, as long as it, as the functional details of the cognitive process are the same, the actual physical instantiation of the process is not that important. Whereas on the inactive side, the inactivists would say if really cognition is fundamentally biological in nature, and they reject a kind of functionalism. They think that, in fact, the details of human embodiment will allow us to say something about human cognition, and human cognition is going to be very different from, frog cognition or whatever, and a different environment a different, what some people call behavioral environment opens up for a human body in contrast to the environment for the frog. So they like to talk about the Umwelt, von Uexküll's idea that the way we experience the world and our cognitive system, that's all relative to the kind of body that we have. And specifically for the enactivists, the focus is on action. So it's a very pragmatic, this is why, in fact, it builds upon the phenomenologists. For example, Heidegger's notion of the ready to hand or Zuhandenheit, and Merleau-Ponty's notion of operative intentionality. It's a very embodied and action-oriented type of analysis of cognition. The way the cognitive system has evolved is highly dependent upon both the evolution of the body and the pragmatic concerns that different animals would have for survival. So, right, there's again a spectrum of that sort of falls under the broad heading of embodied cognition, and what you find are different emphases, some disagreements, some attempts to integrate some of these ideas. In most recent work, people are trying to integrate and trying to find ways to make it a more coherent and consistent story about cognition.
That was fantastic. Thank you. That was a really good description of each one. And I find it funny that you mentioned the Jerry study, because that's also one of my favorite studies, and something that really made me want to study philosophy and psychology was when I started to realize that cognition can so be easily misled, that you have this intuition that you easily make good decisions so that you understand the world. But a lot of times in these types of studies that show cognitive biases, it's like, well, actually you don't. You make a lot of errors. And to me, that was just like literally scary. It's like you're interpreting reality incorrectly. How is that not the most important thing ever? Sure. And so that's something that's made me want to get into psychology and philosophy. And that's one of my favorite studies because, first of all, the effect size from what I remember was pretty big. Like, it wasn't something insignificant. And it's something so basic. It's just like you're just a tiny bit hungry. And it affects your entire judgment so much. And an important judgment at that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they were measuring it, but I think the effect size was something like 60% of a difference between early morning and just before lunch. So that is significant. And there's a lot of really interesting, studies about juries and how they make decisions and how the introduction of some information early in the consideration process can simply change the way the jury goes, as opposed to, holding on to that information until later. And then, of course, all of the research on memory, Elizabeth Loftus and her work, for example, that, and just, the words that, say, an attorney will choose to ask a question can take the answer in a certain direction that they want. All very, very interesting stuff.
Right. There's a lot of similar parallels with research on not exactly what the right term is, but like police officers, investigators, stuff like that, how they make judgments, how they cling to judgments based on just a tiny detail in the beginning. And there's a heavy parallel, and it's all very interesting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Varela and Thompson, which I really like. I tried to get Thompson, but unfortunately he's very busy. And Varela, unfortunately, has passed away. But embodied cognitive science has been very associated with Buddhism. And I wonder if that's how cognitive science has developed based on kind of like our philosophical framework in the West based on a more scientific worldview, and if embodied cognitive science was kind of like precisely what the West was missing, and that's why it has become such a crucial issue, or if maybe it was just like a coincidence that, for example, Varela was just really interested in Buddhism, for example. What do you think? Is it something kind of inherent about how we were doing things in our culture, or it's just a happy coincidence or something like that?
I think definitely cognitive science starts out very much in sort of the Western, influenced very highly by Western philosophy and psychology, and a lot of early cognitive science is Cartesian. People like Fodor and all of that. So I think if you look at, of course, the Cartesian tradition, there's a downplaying of the body. I mean, you could claim that the whole Western tradition downplays the importance of the body. It's all about reason. It's all about what the mind is doing in the head, and bodily processes are not thought to be important, or they are thought to be things that we should suppress in some way. So you have that whole long tradition in philosophy, and it sort of carries over into psychology, and definitely in the origins of cognitive science, that this is also the case, and the computational models, fit in very nicely to that whole idea. So embodied cognition is definitely an attempt to move away from that, the dominance of a kind of Cartesian perspective within philosophy, psychology, cognitive science, and so forth. So he, someone like Varela is very much aware of that. He finds inspiration in people like Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology, but he also, finds a different tradition in the Buddhist psychology, where it's a much more holistic approach. I don't think I can say too much about Buddhism myself. I haven't studied it enough to be able to say something intelligent here, but I think there are conceptions of a lot of the work that's been done now recently has been on sort of mindfulness and meditation practices, and a lot of that work has been inspired by Varela and the Mind and Life Institute, which the Dalai Lama is part of, and so forth, where they actually study, from a neuroscience perspective, what's going on in the brain of the meditator, the long-term meditator. And that's one approach. But Varela was more interested in the method that Buddhist approaches could offer. And he thought the method, the mindfulness, can train the mind so that people who are trained in mindfulness can be sort of, in a sense, experts at something like phenomenology in order to not just report on their experience, but control their experience in a way that people who are not meditators would have a hard time doing. So he thought that could be, could fit very well with his neurophenomenological approach. So there's a couple different things going on in cognitive science having to do with Buddhism, but definitely Varela was influenced by that connection.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Dalai Lama, and if my memory serves me right, you've also met him. Was that with Varela kind of part with the partnership that he had, or was that a separate thing?
Yeah, Varela and the Dalai Lama formed an institute, let's say, where they agreed to meet every year. The Dalai Lama was very interested in Western science and psychology, and Varela was interested in the Buddhist tradition. So they set up meetings every year. That became known as the Mind and Life Institute, which is now flourishing. And they would organize meetings even after Francisco died. The meetings continued. So I think it was maybe because of my association with Francisco that I got invited to go to one of these meetings. And the meetings would be between scientists, one or two philosophers, and the Dalai Lama, meeting and having a dialogue for a week together in Dharamsala. So I think that's probably the connection. Evan Thompson, I think, was arranging one of these meetings, and so I got invited that way. And there's a connection with Dan Zahavi as well, who also got invited, couldn't go, and I went also in his place, so to speak.
And from that type of partnership, from my understanding, it's a very productive collaboration, and it's a very positive thing. But the idea that I have is that underlying that, there is always a very relatively minor but significant kind of conflict of overall worldview, which is kind of like the Western side is kind of like trying to take the Buddhist and Eastern perspective and kind of incorporate it with cognitive science. But it's like, well, the body is important, and like mindfulness is important for, mental health and stuff like that. And there's also this like hyper skill of introspection and stuff like that. And then the Eastern side is interested, in the power and the discoveries that Western science have made. But I always have the sense that one is always trying to convince the other of metaphysical views. So, for example, the Dalai Lama, from my understanding, he's like, well, this is all wonderful, neuroscience and whatever, but you can't fully reduce it to just, chemical processes. There's something that transcends, your science, let's say. Mm. And then the Western side is kind of like the opposite. It's like, you have a bunch of cool stuff here, we'll love it, but like everything that you say about the mind being something other than material, that's completely wrong, basically. Do you have, is my interpretation correct? And do you have like a view of this conflict and where you slide in?
Yeah, well, so I can report what the Dalai Lama said, at the meeting that I went to. And that is that so there's a whole tradition of Buddhist psychology. So he says, if Western science shows that this particular subject matter is it goes this way and it contradicts Buddhist psychology, he says, I'm very willing to change, to give up the Buddhist psychology part and to go with the Western science. Because he thinks Western science is good in that respect. However, he does say there's another level, right? What you call the metaphysical or theological or whatever you want to call it, that has to do with questions about reincarnation or those types of religious issues. And he says that science really is not able to tell us anything about that. So he does make a distinction between what science can tell us about and what it can't tell us about. Yeah, that's true. And as Buddhism, gets accepted into Western practices, I mean, it's not clear that people accept it as a full package. I mean, there are people who are Buddhists, but there are a lot of people who don't consider themselves Buddhists, but they will do mindful meditation or whatever. And that's good enough for them. Yeah.
So let's get finally into your space study. I know you are proud of it. I also found it really interesting. So I'll let you be very broad. So let's first describe exactly what were you trying to discover and why you did it?
Okay. Yeah, so at the time, I was working at the University of Central Florida, which is the closest university to the Kennedy Space Center, where it would launch rockets and such. And there was a lot of research going on at the university in engineering, computer science, directly funded by and relevant to the space program. And along with a couple of people there, I thought, well, I wonder if the humanities could get into this in some way. And there was a professor, actually, he was just kind of a professor emeritus by the time I got there, I think. But he had he had interviewed a lot of astronauts about their experiences. And he had a whole collection, a kind of archive of these interviews, which he shared with me. And I thought this would be interesting to explore in a scientific way, rather than just having interviews. It would be interesting to try to do a study of this kind of experience. And what they described in the interviews were experiences of awe, wonder. They were overwhelmed by what they were seeing, from the space station or from the shuttle, looking out the window at the Earth. They were describing all kinds of experiences. So we wanted to catalog those experiences and then try to do some kind of experiment. So that's what we set out to do. We got some funding and we set up experiments using virtual reality. So a virtual simulation of a space flight. And we had 104 subjects who went into the simulation. And then we did follow-up phenomenological interviews. But this was also a neurophenomenological study, very much in line with Francisco Varela's idea of neurophenomenology. So as the subjects were experiencing in the virtual reality, experiencing their space flight, let's say, we had them hooked up to EEG, FNIR, heart monitoring. So we were looking at what's going on in the brain, what's going on in the body, and of course, then we wanted their descriptions of their experience, and then the whole big task was to try to correlate all of this data, the first person phenomenological data, the third person neuroscientific data, and then we also added a whole set of questionnaires at the end where we were exploring each individual subject's kind of cognitive attitude towards the world, their cultural practices, religious practices, and things like that, to see if any of that kind of background had any kind of impact on what they were experiencing in the simulation. So we had the big problem was we had too much data, and we had to try to correlate it as best we could. And we had to solve some problems, and there were some limitations to this study, right? We were all located on the Earth, and nobody was experiencing, zero gravity. And the subjects that we were, our experimental subjects were undergraduate students mainly, and not the astronauts themselves. We did have one astronaut who was an advisor on the project. So there were a lot of limitations, a lot of issues to resolve, but nonetheless, we think in the end that we were able to replicate a whole set of, we ended up with, I think, 34 different experiences or experiential categories that we were able to replicate through the use of the simulation, so that in the phenomenological interviews, our subjects were reporting the same kinds of experiences as you found in the journals and interviews with the astronauts. So we thought we did a good job in that respect. So I think that this is all published in a few articles, but also in a book in 2015, which is called The Neurophenomenology of Awe and Wonder. And I think for us, it was a very exciting project. It in a certain way, showed how neurophenomenology could be used, and that it can get us to real empirical results.
I was very impressed by the study, and it was very interesting. And I really liked how it was set up. Like for example, when you made sure, for example, to not be misled by your prior conception of what these experiences are. So I like that, for example, you did a thematic analysis of the actual the descriptions of the astronauts that went there. And like, to me, that was great. Like a lot of studies don't do that. They just assume that they know what they're looking for, and then they kind of study that. Yeah. And if I remember correctly, there was actually a discrepancy there, right? Because if you went purely, for example, on kind of like the earthly writings of the astronauts, that actually had a difference than what they actually wrote at the moment, right? And I'm not sure if I remember if you offer an explanation of why there was that discrepancy.
Yeah, so there were definitely different sources that we used. Some of the sources, I think the most important ones for us, were the journals that the astronauts kept during their space flight. And then there were others that were simply follow-up interviews in various contexts that had been published or at least collected. I don't know that there was a huge difference in terms of the actual things that they described. I don't recall that there was any kind of serious difference in terms of the way they would.
I think if I remember correctly, it was more in terms of abstraction. Like I think if I remember correctly, it was more abstract the longer it went.
Yeah.
But then something that also made me more curious about it, if I remember correctly, I might be misremembering, is it was less coherent as well. I'm not sure if that's just an effect of memory over time because you reconstruct it every time you narrate it, or if there's something else going on.
Yeah, so okay, now I know what you mean. So one thing we did when we got all the text together, and we did a syntactical analysis, a computer-generated syntactical analysis of it, and those types of differences did show up in the sense that, they were less concrete in terms of their descriptions. But it wasn't that they were somehow or other contradicting, the journals. It's just that there was a kind of level of abstraction that sort of showed up in the syntactical analysis of the actual sentences that they were using. So we were looking there. What we were looking at there ultimately was not so much to try to discover those kinds of differences between the interviews and the journal keeping during spaceflight. What we were looking for, and the reason we did it, was we compared the descriptions of those awe experiences to descriptions of other kind of pragmatic tasks that they were conducting during the space flight, to see if there was some significant significant findings that we could say when they are describing awe and wonder, it sort of goes this way syntactically in terms of abstraction or concrete use of certain words and so forth. And I don't know that really gave us as much as as say the phenomenological interviews and comparing the phenomenological interviews with just all the astronaut descriptions.
Something else that was very interesting to me was that they seem to have these experiences after doing kind of like mundane, maybe repetitive tasks, that they were kind of involved in their work, and there was this like glimpse, this like window of time where they look out of the window and then they have this awe experience. And did you try to kind of understand why that is? I wonder if it's precisely the fact that they were so absorbed in work that then the contrasts of this beauty and awe that kind of made that experience happen, or do you think there's something else going on?
Yeah, I don't think we tried to get at that precisely. I mean, one thing that we were concerned about was, the very different environment that they are in when they are in the space shuttle or the International Space Station, in terms of gravity, zero gravity. And what we were trying to, determine was whether, was it the whole sort of experience, which is, very, very different from being on Earth and so forth, that generated these kinds of experiences of awe, or was it specifically the visual experience? And almost just every case that we looked at, it was them looking out the window, seeing the Earth from a certain perspective, seeing the rest of the universe and so forth. So that we could really say that it was the visual stimuli that generated these types of experiences. I think it's a good question that you're asking, but we didn't explore that. I suppose we could have tried to, give some busy work to a set of subjects and then have them, enter the simulation. But we didn't actually try to do that. But I don't know if the contrast was the main thing, or just being able to look and see the Earth from a certain perspective.
So another thing that I found interesting about the study is that, so you had all these categories, and some of them translated from the actual experience to the experiment, and some didn't. And I remember that there was a perspectival shift that you managed to achieve, but then there was, you couldn't, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, there wasn't like this feeling of unity that the astronauts have. And I found that very weird, because in my mind, how I had conceptualized the experience is that one causes the other. Do you think that's not the case?
Yeah, well, it's so in one thing to say, first of all, is that not every astronaut who went into space had these experiences. And astronauts who had these experiences, they didn't experience the whole range of the 34 categories that we found across all the different reports. So not everybody experienced everything, and it was exactly the same in our subjects. Not every subject experienced awe and wonder or any aspect of it. Those who did, they didn't experience all of these categories, but rather taking all of the reports or the interviews together, we found that in some cases more than others, people experience these different categories of experience. So very few people might have experienced this kind of feeling of unity, but many of our subjects experienced what we called scale effects. The idea of feeling very small compared to the the hugeness of the universe and that type of thing. And that was, the percentages were even greater in our subjects than were in the astronauts themselves, in that respect. Yeah, so we didn't try, we thought about how these different things were associated with one another in terms of whether they fit the broader category of awe, which was a kind of immediate type of experience, as opposed to wonder, which was something more reflective, which could challenge your cognitive framework of how you understood the universe. But that was a much more slower, reflective type of process, as opposed to an immediate sense of something amazingly, different about what you were seeing and experiencing. So I don't know if that really answers your question.
It does. It makes great sense. And actually, I think my point can be more or less easily undermined by exactly what you said, that not every astronaut has these different levels of experience occur. So if they were causal to the degree that I was thinking, that wouldn't even make sense in the first place. I just didn't think of it. So something that makes me very interested in these types of experiences is because also I'm very interested in psychedelics and in mystical experiences. Either in your own work or other work that you've read, have you tried, or other people have tried to make a connection between these two types of experiences?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work now going on with psychedelics, especially in psychiatry, and it's a relatively new emphasis, I think, in research. I've talked to some of those people, but I don't really, I can't really say very much about. I haven't really read through their experiments or what they're finding very much. The mystical. So I should say that the whole study that we did of space experience. There was a whole team of people. So psychologists, neuroscientists, engineers, that put together the simulation, and another philosopher, Bruce Jantz, who is very familiar with and has studied mysticism, the whole tradition of Western mysticism. One thing, one I think very interesting thing that we kind of discovered late in the game, in the sense that we were doing this analysis of what we had, and then we kind of were running into something that wasn't quite captured by the 34 categories that we had, drawn from the work of the astronauts. And that is simply sometimes the ineffability, the inability to sort of put it into a category or use a concept. And we found in the interviews a lot, which we taped and so forth, a lot of, in the textual transcriptions, a lot of ellipses where basically people were struggling to find the right words and weren't able to. And then kind of settled on something which turns out not to be as as immediate as what they had experienced and so forth. So there was something there which, from Bruce's perspective, touched on the kind of mystical experience. I'm not as familiar with that tradition as Bruce is. So his analysis, I thought, was very important in that respect.
Did he happen, for example, in these types of studies, there's usually, I can't name the name of it from the top of my head, but there's kind of like a scale of a mystical experience that's kind of the standard in research. And I think it's very interesting to see the correlations of that scale with the work that you've done. And because you've taped the interviews, that's actually great, because you can always run whatever kind of analysis you want later. And my prediction is that they would be fairly similar, because at least how I conceptualize those experiences is precisely almost like a weaker form of a mystical experience. And the mystical experience also has this variation and this fragmented nature that these experiences have as well. So not everyone has the same experience. Some people have more oneness, some people have the more ineffability, depending in terms of the questionnaire, for example. Some people also don't get anything at all, even though they're being given drugs that literally make it. And so it has a lot of parallels, and I think it's kind of touching the underlying same thing. And awe seems a bit kind of underlying the whole thing. I think it's very interesting, and if you haven't looked too much into the psychedelic research, I think you would find that very interesting, because I think it's the same thing, more or less.
No, that sounds very promising to look in those directions. We wanted to do other studies of different types of experiences of awe, but it's just a matter of getting the funding to do such things.
Yeah, funding is always the biggest problem in these things. So I know this is a very complex topic, and maybe it's a bit too much to chew on with the time we have left. But I haven't had the pleasure to read it, your book, Action and Interaction, just because I'm just insanely busy now, but it seems very, very interesting. So maybe let's try to pick just a few things so that people get a taste of it. So maybe let's try to give an overall overview of what you try to do with the book. And maybe let's try to get into action as a social phenomenon. That seemed a pretty big part of it. That seemed very interesting.
Right. So, yeah, writing that book, I'm really coming at these topics from an activist perspective, right? So I'm very much in that camp. The first part of the book is about action and agency. So I've worked on this for a while, especially with respect to the sense of agency, the phenomenology of agency, and sometimes how it goes wrong in psychopathology. But I wanted to connect it with the kind of analysis, a kind of action theory analysis of action, and say something specific that would bring those kind of traditions, that kind of the phenomenology of action or agency, together with what had been some work on notions of intention and action theory. So that's the first part of the book, but ultimately it leads to, especially the analysis of the sense of agency, it leads to the idea that social processes are very important for our sense of agency as we act in the world. So that in the second part, I turn more towards those social processes, and specifically towards intersubjective interaction. I take issue with sort of the standard cognitive science approaches having to do with things like theory and simulation theory, very much focus that those approaches are very much focused on the individual mechanisms within the individual brain that are responsible for social cognition. So theory of mind modules or mirror neurons or what have you. And the argument there is, again, something I've worked on, which is, what has now come to be called interaction theory, and the idea that our interactions, our bodily interactions within certain pragmatic environments, do a lot of the work when it comes to our ability to understand the other person. It's not just a matter of me observing and inferring what's going on in the mind of the other, so-called mind reading, but it's rather engaging with others in bodily and pragmatic, contextualized activities that make a profound difference in our understanding of them. So I try to work all the details of that. I talk about empathy. I talk about the direct perception of emotions and intentions. And I talk a lot about the developmental psychology there, the work of Colin Trevarthen, for example, and others. And then the third part of the book, the final part of the book, is about what are the implications of all of that I've just gone through. What are the implications for our social, I would almost say social-political understandings, specifically about how we understand social institutions, how recognition works. So I'm really working there in the tradition of critical theory, people like Axel Honneth's analysis of recognition, for example, that draws from Hegel. So it's a kind of social, political, critical theory context in which I'm asking, what are the implications of all these findings in cognitive science, phenomenology, about interaction and so forth? What are the implications of that for some of the issues having to do with autonomy, recognition, justice? And that's the third part. So it's pretty broad in terms of what I'm looking at. And it's a book some books come very quickly. I think, I have a book called Enactivist Investigations, which I think I wrote in about a year. This one took about 10 years. In between, I was writing other books, but, it was a kind of a long, large project that finally came together in the action and interaction book.
Right, that was great. I'm surprised how concise you managed to be. That sounds lovely. I hope I can have the time to dig more into the specific arguments that you bring into it. And I remember seeing it somewhere that I'm guessing relates to this, that you had like a critique of Heidegger related to social cognition, but I wasn't able to get the paper, but I know that you had some work on it. Can you kind of lay out the main arguments of that?
Yeah, okay. So this, I think, is, at least among Heidegger scholars, it's a controversial claim, but there are a number of people, including someone like Gadamer, Loeth, people who knew Heidegger directly, who always were troubled by his analysis in being in time, for example, of Das Man, the social other. Very, very importantly, I think Heidegger says that human existence is always involves being with, Mitsein, he calls it, being with others. But then when it comes to his precise analysis of how that works, what you find is that it's always kind of framed within the set of pragmatic projects that he describes. So we understand others and we encounter others because when we encounter the world, all of the various objects in the world, all of the instruments that we use have connections with other people. It's almost as if we encounter the other through our encounter with the pragmatic world. So although he emphasizes rightly, I think, the essential aspect of Mitsein, of being with, as part of the very structure of Dasein, or human existence, as he carries out his analysis, it sort of turns into this kind of analysis that from the developmental psychology literature, one would call secondary intersubjectivity. Again, a very important aspect, but what I argue is that Heidegger misses what has been called primary intersubjectivity. And primary intersubjectivity is this face-to-face embodied encounter with the other that depends so much about bodily presence with the other, and not so much directed towards what we're doing here in the pragmatic situation, but rather our kind of face-to-face relationship that has to do with emotional and understanding the other person as another person, I'll put it that way. And that's missing from Heidegger's actual analysis.